Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join us as we learn from area professors and teachers as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for today. Now, here is today's program.
Good day to all of you. We're so glad and appreciative that you join us week by week for our lessons that we call In the Word. And we are in the Gospel of Mark, that part of the Word this week, back to Mark. We're continuing to explore the concept of covenant, which runs all the way through Scripture from creation to consummation. And here we are still in the life of Jesus, talking about the covenant. Last week we talked about his establishment of that new covenant, which he announced at the Last Supper.
Right. Yeah.
And the incorporation of the upcoming details of his death.
And as Hebrews points out, it's a connection to the Old Testament prophecy of Jeremiah that there would be a new covenant.
Right. So there's a sense in which it's all a continuation of God's covenanting tendencies in his relationship with human beings all the way through human history. And then there's another sense in which there's something brand new happening.
It's a new covenant.
Yeah, it's a new covenant. Yeah. Today's lesson brings us to the time of the crucifixion of Jesus. And our lesson title is Jesus Seals the New Covenant. Without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins, and there many of the covenant moments did involve blood sacrifice, and this one certainly does. So
Yes.
we're looking at the crucifixion of Jesus through the lens of the covenant today.
And Mark's gospel, as we've said before, is the shortest of the four gospels, and in some ways a quick look at things. It's not quick with the crucifixion, but briefer than some of the others, and yet very poignant in what it points out and what Jesus went through, and the depth of the sacrifice that was involved.
Yeah. Even though Mark doesn't overwhelm us with details about the event of the crucifixion, or maybe because he doesn't overwhelm us with details, we're able to cut through to some of these things that you're talking about, where we really feel the emotion of Jesus here, and we really see the ultimate point of it with the words of the centurion. Yeah, you know, Mark's gospel begins with a wonderful title. This is the beginning of the good news of Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God.
Right.
That's how Mark begins. So he puts extra focus on that title, Son of God, which meant something to the Romans that we don't normally think of. The emperor was called the Son of God. And so to the Roman mind, that was a title reserved for the emperor.
And Mark's gospel may have been written more to a Roman audience.
Right.
The number of Latin terms that are used in here is a strong emphasis, but all through the gospel, it's fascinating. The miracles that Jesus did, the crowds would raise the question, who is this? How does he do this? Even his own disciples, he calmed the sea on the storm on the sea, and their question was, who is this? How can he do this?
Yeah.
And that question runs all the way through the gospel. It's answered in today's text.
It is, by a surprising person.
Yeah.
So that's our goal. The Gospel of Mark begins with the phrase Son of God, and the climax of our lesson today, near the end of the Gospel of Mark, is going to bring us back to that title, Son of God. We'll see where that fits in. Since our last lesson, which was describing events at the Last Supper, a lot has happened. After the Last Supper, they went out to the Garden of Gethsemane, and there Jesus prayed in agony about what he knew was he was about to face. The sleeping disciples, the betrayal by Judas, the arrest by the temple police force, and then early morning illegal trials at the house of Caiaphas, the high priest, before the Sanhedrin. And as we move into chapter 15 with our lesson today, Jesus has just been brought to the Roman governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate.
Yeah.
And so the second stage of the trial, the Roman trial, is about to begin. All right, well, I'll read our lesson, which is a variety of verses in chapter 15. Now it was the custom at the festival to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. "Do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews?" asked Pilate, knowing it was out of self-interest that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. "What shall I do then with the one you call the King of the Jews?" Pilate asked them. "Crucify him," they shouted. "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The written notice of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And at 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of those standing near heard this, they said, "Listen, he's calling Elijah." Someone ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. "Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down," he said. With a loud voice, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God."
That's a great testimony.
Well, there it is, the Son of God. We've been waiting for some human being to attest to the truth of those words ever since the opening verse of the Gospel of Mark.
All right.
And we finally hear it on the lips of an unexpected person. Well, we'll come back to that.
Yeah.
Now, what's the custom that's referred to back in verse 8?
Well, the
verse 6?
festival, the Passover, was a big holiday with a lot of crowds, and people would return to Jerusalem from all over the scattering of Jews around the Mediterranean basin in the Mideast. And the custom was a kind of a Roman habit to try to appease the people or keep them happy. They would release one prisoner, turn somebody loose.
It's not unusual for a political leader to pardon prisoners or something like that as a gesture of goodwill when they're leaving office or coming into office or whatever. So something like it happens even today. But
Our lesson writer in the standard lesson book talks about the prisoner swap and mentions a time when the Russian spy was exchanged for Francis Gary Powers.
yeah,
We were both familiar with Gary Powers because he was a graduate of college where we taught,
exactly, and where we were students at
Right.
one time as well.
1962.
Yeah, so the release of a prisoner on a special occasion like this is not too unusual in general, and it seems to have been a custom by the Romans. Now, the most prominent Jew in prison at that time was this man named Barabbas, who is the very last person that a Roman governor would have wanted to release.
He was a terrorist.
He was
He'd
an
committed
anti-Rome terrorist.
Yeah, he committed murder. And whether he was one of the Sicarii, the dagger people, who in that time, killing people was not done by mass weapons of mass destruction, but one-to-one.
Yeah.
But the Sicarii were people who would wear a dagger, and any time there was a chance to kill a Roman, the only good Roman's a dead Roman.
Yeah, and these were kind of a especially violent branch of the Zealots. The Zealot movement was trying to drive out the Romans by whatever means. Some zealots were kind of theoretical zealots, and sometimes they tried to rob munitions and things like that from the Romans. But this group were assassins, is what they were. They were assassins. And he, it seems, admittedly, is part of this rebel group and participated in the rebellion and committed murder in the process.
He's not the kind of person you want out in the street.
No. And he's especially not the kind of person, a rabble-rousing rebel, that a Roman governor wants out, able to influence people. So it's all the more shocking that the high priests and the crowds that they manipulated were able to talk Pilate into releasing him in the place of Jesus. So the crowd is referred to in verse 8. They first asked Pilate to release someone for them, what he usually did. And he assumes that the person they want released is the mild-mannered king of the Jews who had come into Jerusalem less than a week before to much popular acclaim, right? But turns out that the high priests don't want Jesus released.
No.
They want their leader of the rebel movement. So the chief priests, according to verse 11, are the ones who manipulate the crowd into asking for Barabbas.
And Pilate knows some of the motives of the chief priests. There's a conflict of interest, competition between them running right along a regular rate. So he's almost tweaking them in saying the King of the Jews.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, in verse 9, the quote is, "You want me to release the King of the Jews?" And of course, that's the title, that's one of the titles that offends them so deeply.
Yeah, the Romans didn't recognize anybody as a King of the Jews.
Yeah, they had named Herod the Great and as the ruler and had given him the title King of the Jews way back in 4 BC, in 40 BC. And then when he died, they didn't trust any of his sons to take over the whole kingdom.
Right.
So they split up the kingdom and gave lesser royal titles to his sons. The one we know best is Herod Antipas, but he was not king of the Jews.
He was a tetrarch, a quarter ruler.
He was a tetrarch, of Galilee and part of Transjordan over there. So there is no king of the Jews right now, and the Romans very jealously guarded that title, and they were the only ones who could give it out, and they weren't giving it out to anybody right then. So it is kind of ironic that here Pilate is using this title for Jesus, but he's doing it to kind of tweak you're absolutely right that the priests and Pilate had a very bad relationship, and Pilate had done a couple of things at the temple that just angered the priests, and so they don't have a good relationship.
He was not a popular leader and did not last long after this.
Right. He was vacillating and went to extremes. Sometimes he would just do anything to placate the crowds, as he does here. This is an example of that end of the spectrum. At other times, he would come down really hard and order mass crucifixions and things like that. So he was not a good ruler. By the way, when he was fired from being the governor of Palestine, he was sent into exile in southern France, which of course is now the Riviera. So anyway, exiled to the Riviera. But back then it was the sticks.
And there's a mountain in Switzerland, Mount Pilatus.
That's right.
Named for Pilate.
That's right, there is. Well, Pilate is confused that they've asked for Barabbas instead of Jesus, and so in verse 12 he says, well then, what am I supposed to do with this one?
The one you call King of the Jews.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Because they didn't call him, they rejected him as King of the Jews. But here he says, you're calling him King of the Jews. And then we get these famous words, crucify him. Look how short verse 13 is. It's not the shortest verse in the New Testament, but it's one of the
close.
shortest.
Yeah.
And it's one of the most powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Crucify him, they shouted. Pilate is still clueless about why they're so against Jesus.
Yeah.
And so I think this is a sincere question in verse 14. What evil has he done?
Yeah, what crime?
I don't get it. If I do crucify him, if I do acquiesce to your demand, I don't know what to charge him with.
And the Romans were famous for laws and keeping the laws.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of crucifying somebody, well, what's the basis?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, he has to name some charge, some crime, and he's clueless as to what it is. The crowd doesn't really give him an answer in verse 14. They just are insistent that he crucify him.
And he doesn't want to riot, so
Yeah.
satisfy the crowd, okay.
Yeah, and that's pure Pilate right there, wanting to satisfy the crowd. That is just the way he operates.
He had Jesus flogged, and we don't know for sure if that was like the Jewish system where they used the cat o' nine tails that ripped a person's back to shreds, or more the Roman with rods where they beat. But either way, it was a horrible experience and sometimes virtually fatal.
Yeah. This Jewish way that you're describing ripped the flesh, ripped the tendons, ripped the muscles.
Mm-hmm.
It led to terrible blood loss.
Oh, yeah.
And sometimes death.
Mm-hmm.
The Roman method, where they had flexible rods that they tied together into a bundle, had a percussive effect. It didn't rip the skin, but it did deeply bruise internal organs as well as tissues, and could easily lead to kidney failure or stop heart failure or whatever. So whatever method they're using, it was horrible.
So by the time a person gets to the point of crucifixion, their body is already beaten to the point where it's horribly.
Yeah. If they had been flogged before the crucifixion, some people ask, how could Jesus have died in a mere 6 hours? Because sometimes if people were just crucified, they hung on the cross for days.
Days, yes. Yeah.
And they didn't die of blood loss. They died of dehydration and exposure and things like that.
Asphyxiation sometimes.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was the more common thing. Here, Jesus has, as you point out, been flogged or beaten within an inch of his life. And so the 6 hours on the cross, while horribly agonizing, I'm not trying to diminish that, was a relatively short time to hang on the cross. At any rate, handed him over to be crucified.
Yeah.
Now, our printed text skips a number of verses here from 16 to 24, and
the soldiers took him and mocked him and beat him more.
Yeah. So here's where the mockery takes place in the palace. Hail, King of the Jews.
They make a crown out of thorns.
That title keeps coming up.
Yes.
They've picked up from Pilate that that title can be used for mockery. King of the Jews. So the mockery in the palace. And then the calling, as they move toward the place of execution, this is where Simon of Cyrene.
Yes, Jesus was
in.
carrying the cross, but apparently fell, and they wanted somebody to, and so they press a person from the crowd.
Yeah.
Happens to be Simon of Cyrene. How do we know about him? He's the father of Alexander and Rufus,
Yeah.
which apparently they were Christians that were known.
Evidently, because he mentions them as if his readers know them. And his readers, who we think were first readers, were Christians in Rome, seem to be acquainted with him.
Yes.
So maybe they too were Christians in Rome, and we don't know about Simon of Cyrene from North Africa, right? Well, that's what we're skipping, and then we come back to the
Third hour.
To the third hour. Yeah. The way Jews told time, it began at 6. So the third hour would be 9 in the morning, 6th hour, noon, ninth hour, 3. And that is literally what it
Yeah.
says. And some of our viewers may still read King James Bibles or other older Bibles, and that's the language that's used there. More modern translations have accommodated to the way we tell time.
Right. Yeah.
So we have 9 in the morning, noon, and 3 in the afternoon. Now, what about this written notice of the charge?
Yeah.
What's going on there?
That was like a proclamation that the prisoner would carry, or someone would carry as they were on the way to the place of crucifixion, declaring what the crime was and why the person was being crucified. And this one declared the King of the Jews. So it was, again, the Roman effort to put the Jews down.
Right. So this, in general, the sign was a warning to other people, don't you dare do this, or you'll end up the way this guy has. So executions in those days were very public events, warning them, as they were throughout history up until very recent times. So yeah, there's something ironic about this charge, King of the Jews. He's still tweaking the Jews themselves.
And John tells us that it was put up in 3 languages.
Yeah.
Greek, which was the normal language all over the Mediterranean area after Alexander's conquests. Latin, which of course was the Roman official language, and Aramaic. And it says Hebrew in some places, but that would have been the Aramaic, which is what the common people spoke.
Right.
So the first translation of the gospel, as it were,
took place on this sign,
Yeah.
which, and you're right. Sometimes it was hanging around the neck of the prisoner. Sometimes evidently affixed to the cross. The full title appears to have been Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Mark kind of abbreviates it a little bit, as Mark does, by just giving us the King of the Jews. And some of our viewers might be interested to know that that charge, that title of his crime, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, is the source of the abbreviation that we used to see a lot in church art and architecture, INRI.
Jesus, I,
Yeah, and then
Nazareth.
and then Rex Judiorum, the Latin for King of the Jews.
Yeah.
So INRI, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And I remember growing up, there was a cross on the communion table in my home church, and right in the center of it, where the 2 beams crossed, it said INRI. And of course, I had no idea what that meant when I was a child, but I eventually figured it out. So everybody should know. That's what was on the cross. So what was mockery to a Roman and blasphemy to a Jew is the statement of faith to a Christian.
Right.
Yeah. INRI.
Yeah.
All right. What do we miss in the next missing verses?
Well, the bandits, the 2 who are crucified with him, mock him, and the people and the priests deride him, and especially say he saved others, but he couldn't save himself. And then the bandits also taunt him, and then it picks up again at noon, verse 33.
Everybody taunts him.
Yeah.
Just the passers-by
Yeah.
mock him because he's being crucified. The priests, of course, do. Everybody does. I'm so struck by the statement of the priests. Come down from the cross and we will believe in you.
Yeah.
What a statement. Do one more miracle, do one more amazing miracle, and we claim that we will believe in you. It struck me at one point that they at least claimed that they would have believed in him if he had come down from the cross. We believe in Jesus precisely because he did not come down from the cross.
But you think about his physical suffering. We talked about the beatings and then the extended mockery by the soldiers and the suffering on the cross. And then you add in the taunting and the derision. And it's suffering to an extreme.
It is. Yeah, it's an agonizing event.
Yeah.
Well, that brings us to the words that Jesus cried out from the cross. These are the words that Mark quotes for us. And they're a quote actually, from Psalm 22, verse 1. Jesus cried out in a loud voice, and Mark gives them to us in Aramaic.
Yes.
The actual words that Jesus would have spoken, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani. And then he translates, of course, in Greek for his readers, my God, why have you forsaken me? Many people take these words just at face value and have developed a big emphasis on how God cannot look upon sin, and God had turned his back on Jesus, and that Jesus felt abandoned by God at this moment. I'm not fond of that interpretation. It seems to me that God precisely looks sin square in the eyes at every point. God has never flinched at sin.
No.
God has always reacted to it, dealt with it, and he's dealing with it here on the cross. I think something way more complex is happening here.
I do too.
What do you think?
I've always thought Psalm 22, the opening verse, which Jesus quotes here, he knew the Hebrew Scriptures, and he'd memorized Scripture. And that Psalm of Lament came to mind because he was suffering as he was. But Psalm 22, if you look at the chapter, it describes almost in amazing detail what Jesus was going through.
Yeah. It's a messianic psalm which seems to predict the death of the Messiah. And what are some of the things that it mentions? The
Gambling for the clothes.
Okay. The thirst. The fact that his legs were not broken.
Right.
You can see all his bones. The crowds of people.
Encircled by dogs, or Gentile dogs.
Yeah. So many details. So there's a sense in which part of what Jesus is doing is reminding them that his death has been prophesied in a psalm in amazing detail.
But that psalm doesn't stop with the lament. It goes on to the expression of praise to God because of the victory given.
Yeah. Every lament psalm in the book of Psalms includes a cry of agony or distress, but it also always includes an expression of trust in God, hope in God's ultimate plan, and praise of God.
Right.
So without diminishing at all the agony that Jesus is experiencing, both physical and psychological and emotional, which you rightly emphasized, I think we can add into it that Jesus is reminding, he's almost teaching right up to the last minute that that they are putting the Messiah to death.
Yeah.
Not just...
And that God will vindicate and God will be praised.
Yes. And in the midst of his agony, he's actually crying out in trust and hope and praise of God.
Right.
Not that God has abandoned him, but that God is there with him in his most extreme moment of agony.
And people hear the Eloi and think it's Elijah. And of course there's the expectation Elijah will come before the Messiah, which Jesus said he's already come.
Yeah.
But then there's this final word.
Final from the centurion.
The centurion. And centurions get good reputation in the New Testament, but this one especially.
This one especially. We hope that you'll join us in crying out in faith with the centurion, truly, this is the Son of God. And we also hope that you'll join us next week as we continue our study of God's covenant.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson brought to you as a ministry of First Christian Church in Johnson City, Tennessee. Our thanks to our teachers that led us for this week's lesson. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of First Christian Church.